All right. Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I'm not mic'd, but this thing might be picking up something of my voice. So welcome everyone to what is now the fifth annual Berkeley Lecture on Religious Tolerance. I'm Jonathan Sheehan, and I'm professor of history here and co-director along with my colleague Mark Csikszentmihalyi from the East Asian Languages and Cultures of the Berkeley Center of the Study of Religion. So it gives me just huge pleasure tonight to be able to introduce our speaker, Karen Barkey, professor of sociology and the Haas Distinguished Chair of Religious Diversity here at the University of California at Berkeley. Professor Barkey is, I think, the most learned and humane and considered scholar of religious pluralism that I know working on the topic today. She grew up in one of the heartlands of religious difference in Istanbul, Turkey, before she came to the United States to do her undergraduate, graduate, and later her professional life. She, since the beginning of this scholarly life, has tried to understand and explain the workings of multi-ethnic polities, places like the Ottoman Empire, with a complex organization of religious and ethnic groups, many claimants and competitors for state power, and spanning a huge and varied terrain of geography and peoples. Her prize-winning first book, for example, titled Bandits and Bureaucrats, The Ottoman Route to State Centralization, which came out in 1994 with Cornell University Press, explored how the Ottoman state creatively recruited would-be rebels, peasants, mercenaries, and so on to projects of state building. Centers and peripheries develop in tandem. She argued an insight that she deepened by situating the Ottomans in a rich comparative surround. Indeed, I think characteristic of her work is an ecumenical interest in the varieties of states and empires that have developed since the Middle Ages. The title of her 1997 edited volume, After Empire, Multi-Ethnic Societies and Nation Building, the Soviet Union and the Russian and Ottoman and Habsburg empires, gives you a sense of the breadth of her curiosity, a breadth that also lent her 2008 monograph, Empire of Difference, the Ottomans in Comparative Perspective, such energy and creativity. So all these works were written at Columbia University, where Barkey was a professor from 1989 to 2016. In 2011, there in New York, she was appointed director of both the Columbia's Institute of Religion, Culture, and Public Life and the Center for Democracy, Religion, and Toleration. And there she began working on a series of ambitious projects on the past, present, and future of religious pluralism. As always in her work, a deeply historical sensibility converges with crisp sociological analysis and real interest in and attention to the world that we find ourselves in today. The answer to the question, how did people in the religiously plural world of the Eastern Mediterranean manage to live in such close proximity, and even at times create sites of shared religious value, speaks in her work to some of the most urgent questions we face now, both here at home and abroad. Already she's edited a volume on the subject with Elazar Barkan entitled Choreography of Sacred Spaces, State, Religion, and Conflict Resolution. She's developed a magnificent website that you guys should go have a look at, sharedsacredsites.net, and curated an international exhibition on the subject that we're hoping to bring to Berkeley sometime in the future. So speaking of which, it was with tremendous delight then that we welcomed Professor Barkey to the faculty here at Berkeley earlier this year, and we're now standing, I think, at the end of her first year officially at Berkeley, and we couldn't be luckier to have you here. So before I announce the title of the talk and we get going, a word about the lecture in the series, neither of which would have been possible without the endowed Fund for the Study of Religious Tolerance. This fund was established by Andy Rowan, a member of the class of 1976, to enable the university to promote and disseminate research on religious tolerance and intolerance in the hopes of deepening our understanding of religion's many roles in the modern world. We would like to take a moment to thank Andy for his generosity. Professor Barkey's talk, moreover, is the last event this year at the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion. It's been a tremendous year for us with many events, as many of you know. None of these would have been possible without the generous support of the humanities and social science deans, Anthony Cascardi and Carla Hessa. None would have been possible without the support of our incredible staff, one of whom wants me to remind you to turn off your cell phones, and none of which would have been possible without the interest that you all here have shown us consistently over the year. If you are interested in future activities of the center or in finding out how to support future projects, there's a table with materials outside in the hall, as well as a sign-up sheet for email newsletter. So now that's enough of me. Karen Barkey's talk tonight is entitled Living with Difference, Shared Religious Sanctuaries in the Ottoman Lands. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I think I'm going to have a hard time living up to everything you've said, but I will try. So I'm really happy to be here at Berkeley, and I really thank all of the different parts of Berkeley that have welcomed me this year, especially BCSR, the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion, the Sociology Department, the HIFIS, the Haas Institute, and all the other parts of Berkeley that have been really welcoming. So it's the end of my first year, and I think that after this, I just take a break. This talk is about tolerance. I'm not going to talk about the philosophy of tolerance, but I'm going to talk about examples of it. All we speak about these days is intolerance, and we yearn for more civility, tolerance, and respect across difference. Part of our present discomfort has to do with the lack of religious tolerance across the world, and as we focus on the narratives and the news of violence, we often ignore that in many places where ethnic and religious conflict and violence occur, there have been long periods of peace and coexistence before and after violence. We tend to forget that Hindus and Muslims, Jews and Muslims, Sunni and Shia, Muslims and Christian, and many other divided groups have accommodated to each other for long periods of history. Places in the Mediterranean basin, South Asia, the Middle East, and Africa have been sites where diversity has engendered coexistence, interreligious peace, and harmony, whether directed by enlightened leaders or initiated on the ground through the collaboration and efforts of the peoples defined by their difference. So given the prevalence of conflict today, it is hard for us to imagine religious spaces, churches, shrines, mosques, mausoleums, that are shared by more than one religious and ethnic group. Yet there are today, in the post-Ottoman world, just to take one example, countless sacred sites that are venerated by more than one religious group. Let me offer just first a definition of this phenomenon. Shared sacred sites are religious sanctuaries where people from different religious and ethnic backgrounds are able to live with difference, accommodate to each other's religious needs, and negotiate in public their otherness. Hundreds of such sites can be found in historical sources, and many continue to be shared despite the often violent unmixing of peoples and nationalizing policies of nation-states that emerged in the post-imperial, post-colonial world. Practices of sharing religious space have survived, showing their rich and textured fabric of mixed traditions, amalgamated narratives, and jointly incorporated superstitions and beliefs. In these spaces where people still mix, they constantly innovate within a traditional practice. They supplement, they rationalize and explicate to make sensible to themselves and their interlocutors why they belong and why is this experience historical or contemporary to make sensible to themselves and their interlocutors why they belong. It is in this experience, historical and contemporary, that I'm interested in carrying. I mixed up my sentences here. That I'm interested in carrying out a study of how and why people entered structured situations that are defined by difference and construct meanings to appropriate this difference in shared sacred spaces across time along the history of the Ottoman Empire and modern Turkey, Greece, and the Balkans. My primary purpose is to understand the conditions under which sharing of sacred sites is possible, how sharing comes about, why it continues, persists across time, and what we can learn from these experiences about models of diversity that work. I believe that my story puts forward a powerful narrative of tolerance and cross-faith, cross-cultural coexistence. I start with a few examples of the contemporary practice of sharing before I move back in time to explain the circumstances under which this sharing emerged in the Ottoman Empire. In the contemporary cases, we can actually observe choreographies of sharing and belonging and talk to people to understand their actions and the meanings that they attribute to what they do and what they say. In the historical cases, we have to rely on the historical documentation of coexistence, the histories, the images, the hagiographies, and if for some periods, if possible, travelers' reports that are both foreign and native. Each methodology has its own difficulties and pitfalls. Now, the Marmara Sea, in this picture that you see a postcard of, the Marmara Sea off the shores of Istanbul is dotted with 4 relatively big islands that were the centers of summer residences for the Greek, Armenian, and Jewish communities of Istanbul during the Ottoman Empire. As I was growing up in Istanbul, I went there every summer of my childhood. And every Saturday morning, my self-respecting Jewish grandfather took me on a long trek up the hills to a Greek Orthodox monastery, St. George, where he said he felt close to God. Spending the morning between the natural beauty of my surroundings and the incense-filled and glittering space of the monastery, I hardly understood that I was sharing the space with Christians and that as a Jew, this was perhaps not my place. Much later, participating in the April 23rd I'm not participating at this time period. I'll show you more pictures of it. At the April 23rd pilgrimage day at the monastery as an adult, I understood that this Greek monastery was also venerated by Muslims and Jews, and that they arrived in thousands on that day to pray and to make a wish. St. George is perhaps one of the figures around whom most cross-fertilization between Christians and Muslims in the Eastern Mediterranean has occurred. The monastery is popular because St. George is reputed to be efficacious and makes no distinctions between Christians and Muslims. This is an end of the 19th century photograph of the 23rd of April pilgrimage day. So already at that time, we know that this pilgrimage was happening. This is what it looks like today on an empty day. This is the view, and I guess you understand why my grandfather liked to go there. Religious women sitting on the day of the festival. When the festival starts with a very interesting tradition of unspooling the thread from the beginning of the valley up the hill in silence while you're praying and making a wish. And these are a few pictures from different photographers, colleagues of mine, who did the festival and the pilgrimage with me. Then you go by the monastery and you light a candle, and then you enter. We were not allowed to take pictures. By the way, all the bad pictures are mine. All the good pictures are by my colleagues. Writing a wish, another picture of writing a wish. And then people waiting to be blessed, Muslims, Christians, and Jews waiting to be blessed by the priests at the monastery. And these are sugar cubes that indicate the wish that you make, a house, a car, infinity, health, and things like that. So they all indicate the wish that people are making. Another important pilgrimage, and I think I have a picture, Another important pilgrimage site in Turkey is the House of Mary in Ephesus, where Catholics, Orthodox, and Muslims all revere Mary, the mother of Jesus. While visitors come through the whole year, on the 15th of August, a special festival for the Feast of the Assumption of Mary brings the clergy of the three religions together for a special Mass. The Catholic shrine is on a hill above Ephesus and is regarded as a possible site for the Assumption of Mary. And it was discovered in the 19th century by French missionaries, and the site grew in popularity right after that. As we know, Mary is venerated both by Christians and Muslims, and she's the only woman mentioned by name in the Quran, and there are surahs in the Quran that are dedicated to her. So Marian worship is common among Muslims in the Middle East. This is the wishing panel where everybody puts their wish in and this is a miniature of the Annunciation that is also in the same theme of Mary. Muslims visit the Catholic Church of Saint Antoine in the cosmopolitan Pera district of Istanbul on Tuesdays for a Mass in Turkish. A mixed group of believers joins prayers, write their problems and their wishes in a large notebook, and seek advice from the priest. Non-Christians linger, old ladies with headscarves timidly and quietly spend time in front of the statue of Saint Antoine and pray in the Muslim fashion, finishing with a sad-sounding Amin. They are joined by the well-dressed crowd of secular men and women who stop on their way to work for a simple prayer and a lighting of a candle before they re-enter the hustle of modern Istanbul. Today, Saint Antoine is well known for its multiple devotional crossings, the mixes of religions who come to experience a Catholic Mass in multiple languages. I bring this church to your attention because also we can easily trace this church and its mixed audience through history. A chapel named Saint Antoine of Padua existed in the Kasımpaşa in another district of Istanbul in the 17th century, and at the same time there was also another church and hospital complex dedicated to the Abbé Saint Antoine by the city walls near the water that served as an important pilgrimage site for Christians, Catholics, Orthodox Greek and Armenians, and Muslims together, who went to pray, especially on Saturday evenings when the priest would read the gospel and dab the sacred oil on the congregants for the healing of their ills. The church and the hospital complex were confiscated by the state in 1640, no doubt because of these mixed practices and the ease with which Muslims attended, since this period, which was called the Kadızadeli period, was a short-lived moment in Ottoman history of extreme Sunni fundamentalism. The next Saint Antoine of Padua, a church, was erected in 1724, and through various changes we come to this particular church that opened in 1912. And I'll show you a few pictures. So women are here praying in front of the statue of Saint Antoine, lighting candles, and now I'm in Eyüp in the next phase. The mosque and the shrine of Eyüp are situated in the eponymous Muslim neighborhood with its famous Ottoman cemeteries on wooded hills overlooking the entire city. Eyüp owes its name to the city's most sacred Muslim grave, the illustrious türbe, the shrine of the Saint Eyüp Sultan, believed to have been the companion of the Prophet and a leading participant in the first Arab siege of Constantinople. This shrine has ever since the Ottoman conquest of Istanbul been the city's most important place of pilgrimage, ziyaret in Turkish, and religious devotion. Visitors who come to request some form of supernatural intervention by the spirit of Eyüp Sultan try to replicate more heterodox and mixed rituals. Sunni, Alevi, and Sufi practices get compacted into particular moves and performances. They may invoke the blessing of Sultan Eyüp, ask for support in problems of health or other worldly difficulties, and make a vow, an adak, promising the sacrifice of a chicken or sheep if the wish was fulfilled. Some even bring their sacrifice at once in the first time to speed up fulfillment of the wish. Here, Sunni and Alevi Muslims and some Jews and Christians participate in the wish-making, a practice that is not looked upon kindly by the authorities. This is Eyüp Sultan, women praying, and if you pay attention on the wall, people write, and that's where they write their wishes. And every so often, the authorities come and whitewash the wishes because they say that according to Sunni Islam, you're not supposed to make wishes. The next day, people start writing wishes again. This is the list of restrictions that they have put since my childhood in Istanbul. This was not there. They put this list of restrictions of what you cannot do as practices that are violating Sunni Islam. One more place, and then I'll move into history. Greek Orthodox churches, where I've worked many summers, are an important site of religious mixing between Christians and Muslims who share devotion to the space. There are around 10 such shared functioning churches in Istanbul, each with its own important temporality and particular sharing rituals. These Greek Orthodox sites often share the common feature that they have a spring or a source of holy water, ayazma, that benefits, brings blessings, cures illnesses, and provides health to worshippers. The legend of the benefits of these sources of holy water was established sometimes in the Ottoman, sometimes in the Byzantine, or even pre-Byzantine times. Each ayazma has a particular history, a narrative of discovery, and it is referred to in various historical descriptions. The history is associated with a miracle and of curing an illness, often of a dignitary, who then establishes a church in the said location. The benefits of the water and the sacrality of the space are transmitted from generation to generation through familial and neighborhood stories. While these are some of the many examples of shared churches and monasteries around Istanbul, there are many more across the former lands of the Ottoman Empire in the post-Yugoslav territories in Greece, Albania, Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and also in sites in Israel, Palestine. Many in Israel, Palestine are contested and prone to violence, but also some are quietly and peacefully shared. Across these lands, there are actually numerous choreographies of sharing sacred spaces. While in Istanbul, many spaces exhibit joint prayer on particular saints' days, different sites vary in the ritual and the spatial organization of worship. In Macedonia, for example, the Church of Sveti Nikola, on the day of the Orthodox pilgrimage of St. George, is prepared for Christians, removing the Muslim images. This is when it's Muslim. Removing the Muslim images, the carpets and the prayer beads, and the space is Christianized. The site is visited by hundreds of Christian pilgrims on May 6th, and on May 7th, the church is brought back to its regular mixed form, a Christian church and a Sufi shrine. Pictures of Ali are added. They are taking the covering of the picture of Ali. The carpets are added in order to return it to its regular use, where a mix of religious objects and images provide the symbols to pick and choose from for the visitors of the day. In other sites, such as Durbalı Tekke in Larissa, Greece, Sufi, Albanian, Muslim immigrants, and Greek Orthodox faithful share the tekke. And while the Muslims use the interior, where the coffins of the Sufi sheikhs are neatly arranged, Christians remain outside the tekke, on one side where they pray, in front of icons and a cross arranged to compose an altar. So this is Durbalı Tekke. This is the entrance to Durbalı Tekke, where you see the picture of Ali and also angels. This is Hacı Bektaş. It's a Bektaşi türbe, so the picture of Hacı Bektaş, the Sufi leader, is hung there. Here is the interior where the tombs are, where the coffins are, and this is the exterior with the cross, the little altar. But as you can see, there are images of St. George, but there's also an image of Ali right in the middle of the Christian space. So again, this mixing of symbolism. In each of these spaces, some similarities of practice, ritual, and shared understandings reflect the possibilities of tolerance, respect, and community building among groups differentiated across boundaries of religion, as well as degree of religiosity. A few conclusions from this early material to ponder over. First, in all of these, the sacred space is claimed by one religious group and is visited by many others who cross boundaries. Crossing over to worship in another religion's sacred space is not about the desire to convert. It is about a devotional crossing that searches for a particular benefit. In the sacred space, visitors are looking for the same benefits, the healing, the fortune, the goodwill that they know have worked for the members of the other religion. Therefore, they will copy and mimic the behavior of the owners of the space and to produce the same effects. Candle lighting, bowing before the iconostasis, praying, often kissing the icons, washing with and drinking the holy water are some of these rituals. These rituals are not unknown to many Muslim devotees who have similar traditions in their various Sufi and Alevi shrines. The important variation among visitors is about the degree to which they are willing to mimic and violate the dictates of their own religion. While the research of Glenn Bowman, who worked on Sveti Nikola in the Balkans, shows that Muslims will not cross themselves or kiss icons in the church, such practices are clearly violated in Istanbul. The Muslims who come to the churches in Istanbul overwhelmingly assert their Muslim identity. They express their respect and reverence for God. They all say God is one and the same for all of us. And they also express their respect for the saints associated with the space and the place itself. Another important outcome of such sharing is the construction of larger multi-religious communities, in the sense that whether groups of men and women from different religions come together and pray at a sacred space, or they build they build their group from different religions who come together and pray at the sacred space, they make community. They build a community at the space, especially in the aftermath of prayer, in courtyards, in small rooms, as part of the trek across a sacred geography of the city, expressing always respect and mutuality that is constantly present. Conversations in the courtyard start with, for example, Muslims saying, "We bring sugar cubes when our wish comes true and offer it to everyone. What do you do for the same reason when your wish comes true? What is your practice?" And that way conversations start and communities across the religion start building. Often traditions are articulated and are also expressed and discussed in terms of a memory of a glorious past. In all of these examples, such practices are expressed as part of an Ottoman legacy of sorts. Possessing tremendous religious and ethnic and linguistic diversity, the Ottoman Empire, I couldn't resist, from 1299 to 1923, gave rise to many forms of coexistence, peaceful or otherwise, that now offers us a genuine laboratory of research possibilities that have yet to be exhausted. There is ample proof that the Ottoman Empire is still relevant to discussions of diversity, and that the millet organization of religious communities is understood as a relatively successful historical example of ruling diversity. One of the ways that this diversity expressed itself was through the explicit sharing of these sanctuaries, whether they were Christian, Muslim, or even Jewish. Therefore, it is clear that there is the effect of a long-standing cultural and religious symbiosis, a society that has for many centuries had high levels of Muslim-Christian interaction and has developed certain ritual practices which could be seen as partially syncretic. Symbols have been absorbed and exchanged over time without a full merging of religious traditions. So what is this Ottoman tolerance about, and how do we go back in history? Reflecting on these traditions of devotional crossings, we have to go back in time to the boundaries of the late Byzantine and Seljuk empires and to the beginnings of the Ottoman Empire. Seljuk and Byzantine. That's the best I could do for a map. But such a starting point has to at least acknowledge the continuity with earlier relational imbrications of early medieval Islamo-Christian encounters with the Abbasids and the Umayyads, a Middle Eastern Christianity, as well as the Crusaders in Palestine and the Spain of Al-Andalus. It has to also acknowledge a pattern of Christian-Sufi relations and an openness on the part of Sufis to Christianity in this early period as well. Such a history has been well documented, especially by European scholars. The Eastern Mediterranean region experienced over the centuries a particular multicultural engagement, possible especially at the fluid and changing frontiers between empires. From the 11th century on, we can talk about numerous population movements as Crusaders went south, Sufi brotherhoods moved into the Anatolian Peninsula, Muslim Turks went west after the Battle of Manzikert, bringing their Central Asian traditions with them, and empires went through serious fluctuations in their fortunes, losing and gaining territory and people. As we rethink the relations at the interstices of empires, in the liminal spaces of frontier regions, we encounter zones of negotiation and accommodation that fueled creativity, diversity, and interconnectedness. New groups that entered the fray of imperial relations sought to incorporate the social structures on the ground as well as accommodate to the people and the practices. Conquest and settlement was facilitated by a fluid and dynamic frontier region where the boundaries between Islam and Christianity were famously porous. Islam and Christianity became relatively familiar with each other, opening up possibilities for cultural exchange and forbearing. Even before the Ottomans emerged, political and cultural exchanges between the Seljuk and the Byzantine empires were not just relations of warfare, they were relations of friendship. Rulers escaped to one another's side of the border, asking for protection from enemies. And both Muslims and Christian rulers borrowed freely from a repertoire of images from a variety of traditions in constructing their self-presentations. There were relations of competition. They hired each other's best soldiers and mercenaries. These were also relations of conversion, since the Turkic warriors who became Byzantine fighters often ended up converting to Christianity, and Byzantine men turned companions of Turkish lords often became Muslims. Trade and politics brought Turks to Constantinople, where they gathered around their mosque in a district especially accommodated to their needs. As Christian women married Seljuk rulers, churches were maintained close to the Seljuk palaces to provide places for the Christian entourage of the Sultan to pray and to ensure that their religious needs were met. Moreover, myth, legends, and holy figures were appropriated by both cultures. Scholars of these frontiers who have studied the texts of the Byzantine and Turkish chroniclers assert that each knew the language of the other, peppering their writing with foreign words and expressions. This bilingualism makes sense in the context of multiple myths and legends which emphasized interfaith alliances and passions, crossing geographical and cultural frontiers. Christians and Muslims told analogous narratives. They cohabitated, adopting each other's characteristics. A beautiful, this is early empire at the conquest of Istanbul, but a beautiful frontier tale provided the motivation for the construction of a monument to the mythical Muslim warrior, I never know how to pronounce that word, Sayyid Battal Ghazi, which was turned into a pilgrimage site for all who considered themselves of mixed Christian Muslim heritage. In this romantic epic, a Muslim fighter, Sayyid Battal, is supposed to have laid siege to Amorion, a Byzantine town, where the daughter of the local castellan, the governor in the Byzantine Empire, fell in love with him. but accidentally caused his death. It is said that the two lovers were buried together in the mausoleum, a Christian woman and a Turkish man. This is the mausoleum. A similar Byzantine tale set during the Arab-Byzantine Wars tells the story of Digenis Akrites, a Christian fighter himself the offspring of a cross-frontier love affair between a converted Arab emir and a Byzantine noblewoman. The assimilation of such narratives into the folklore of populations who interacted in their daily lives made these stories and their carriers more alike. The emergence of the Ottoman Empire occurred within this frontier zone and was further characterized by a particular openness to the Christian majority, developing strategies of toleration, istimalet, especially since the dynamics and the demography of the region necessitated inclusion of Christians rather than their exclusion. The main agents of war and accommodation were the Turkish beys, the local leaders of the diverse post-Selçuk small polities, and the Sufi dervish chiefs who had settled in Anatolia in the 11th and 12th centuries, bringing their inner worldly mysticism, their syncretic practices, such as communion and confession, to the heart of Anatolia. In many ways, the work of conquest was the work of the Turkish beys, and the work of settlement, colonization, conversion, as well as joint devotion was the work of the Sufis. What happened to the religious sanctuaries during this process of expansion? First, there is no doubt that many Christian sanctuaries and churches were transformed into Muslim ones. As we know, for example, from the example of Hagia Sophia, the architectural jewel of Constantinople, the important urban churches with great visible symbolic value were converted into mosques with a process of Islamization initiated right away. As such, the language of sultanic authority and its politics per se, was undeniably sacralized. This meant moves against religious establishments were politically directed, but still justified and understood in a religious idiom, for that was the idiom of the empire. Not only was the space converted, but an immediate process of writing the narrative of the space as linked to Islam, since its very construction was also initiated. And I will come back to this later and the meaning of this. However, in rural areas, conversion or shared use occurred through gradual and more peaceful intrusion or through the reoccupation of abandoned sites. For urban cases, the numbers are harsh. Out of 417 urban monasteries known within the borders of the Byzantine Empire in the 12th century, 80 still existed at the eve of the Ottoman conquest, and 20 remained after 1453, and 6 continued into the modern times. So we're, in terms of urban sanctuaries, we're talking about destruction and conversion. In the rural case, out of the 283 rural monasteries, 158 existed on the eve of the Ottoman conquest, 91 survived after, and 62 continued into the modern period. Among the sites of gradual and peaceful intrusion, which some scholars have called sites of respective hospitability, three processes became prevalent. One, the transformation of a church into a mosque or a Sufi shrine, where Christians were welcome either on festivals or saints' days or more regularly. Two, Christian sites remained Christian managed but were visited by Muslims. Three, new Muslim sites were built and Christians were welcomed in to worship with the Muslims. Though there are probably multiple trajectories of how this happened, how the transformation happened, we can construct more or less a stylized version that encompasses some of this variation. During this advance of the Ottomans, the dervish orders took a number of Christian churches, saints' tombs, and sanctuaries, thus greatly contributing to the evolving process of Christian-Islamic interactions and syncretism, which had already begun in Anatolia earlier. Under the influence of dervish leaders, interactions between Christianity and Islam led to the sharing of sanctuaries and traditions. Colonization was a method of Islamization, but also a process of diffusion of institutions, and particularly of the ideological activity of the institutions. A widespread process of installation of Islamic religious and educational institutions and of the material signs of Muslim religion, culture, and way of life. Ömer Lütfi Barkan, who's written most on this, sees the colonization of newly conquered lands not only as a demographic phenomenon, but also as the establishment in the Balkans of dervish institutions with their material centers, their hospices, their lodges, with the creation of endowments, the land grants, and resource grants to start a settlement, and the endowment of complexes by Ottoman officials, making use of the land received from the sultans in the form of vakıfs. Dervishes of various orders built cloisters and lodges and hospices and other establishments such as soup kitchens for the poor, where they fed people regardless of religion, shops, mills, caravansarais which serviced the trade routes. Tekkes and zaviyes, these lodges, were built most often at the tomb of a tekke founder who would be pronounced a hero or a saint. So these became the sites of the propagation of heterodox Islam, often attracting members of both faiths and exercising great influence over local people. It is then these dervish settlements which strategically established themselves in close proximity of Christian hamlets that we see the various commercial, welfare, and communal networks between Christians and Muslims, and we can surmise that these networks led to interaction, communication between the religions, and familiarity facilitated that next step, which is the cultural and religious exchanges. So you have economic and all kinds of social welfare and social exchanges that then get overlaid with religious and cultural exchanges, as demonstrated by prayers in both churches and convents. Often, Muslims started visiting the Christian site and became convinced of its sanctity and its efficacy through miracles, but also the manner in which some places were inhabited by dervishes in peripheral places was interesting and appealing to Christians who thought that those spaces were actually imbued with healing power. So you can see that each side expected something from the other in terms of healing and mysticism. These Sufi mystics were actually already very well known in pre-Ottoman Anatolia for their work of conversion of religious sanctuaries associated with Christian holy figures and saints into Muslim sites and Muslim figures and saints, but with Christian worship continuing. So we have to talk about the saints a little bit and the continuity here, and then I will end. Why did such processes of colonization and transference of sites and their sharing stick? We can speak about the conversion of sites. We can speak about the establishment of Ottoman sovereignty through colonization of space. Yet we have to also explain why Muslims and Christians, and in some places also Jews, found it possible to meaningfully share sites and not expel the other from their space. I argue that the cult of saints, three saints in particular, who were used interchangeably, and the powerful religious language of the hagiographies of the time worked together to construct shared meanings for common people. The worship of saints was a potent force in bringing the faithful together, even though saint worship was seen as a recourse to intermediaries, and as such was sometimes criticized and condemned in Islam and Judaism. This veneration was widespread and acted to bring people together. Often the faithful prayed in a shrine linked to another religion just because they were drawn by the power attributed to the saint, who was said to respond to the needs of health, fertility, happiness, love, exorcism. The saints were and are still today in these churches in many places in popular thought analogous intermediaries. They are interchangeable and are considered and understood in the same way. Therefore, the actual procedure of healing in a Muslim shrine would be totally familiar to Christians whose local sanctuaries were imbued with healing powers quite akin to their neighbors. In Anatolia and in the Balkans, Muslims and Christians venerated St. George and Hıdır as shared saints. Hıdır is the Muslim. I'll talk about him in a minute. In the Arab territories of the empire and Palestine, Jews, Christians, and Muslims shared St. George, Hıdır, and Elijah as the Jewish prophet, saint prophet. So when we talk about joint veneration, we have to explore the utility and the meaning that saints have in popular imagination. And I will just concentrate on Hıdır because I don't have much time. But Hıdır is the Islamic saint Hıdır is identified as, in Muslim tradition, as the unnamed companion of Moses, who holds the secret to immortal life and who occupies a unique place in Muslim belief for his role as an elusive figure both of immortality and esoteric knowledge, linked to Christianity and Islam as well as Judaism. He is both the product of the transmission of religious and literary knowledge at the level of sophisticated and urban traditions, while also existing in the popular mystical understanding of the believer, of the more popular meanings. Hıdır is charged with the sacralization and the Islamization of space and worship. He's the healer, the helper, the rescuer, with mystical charisma and supernatural ability, whom people believe will make miracles and rescue them. Hudr crosses time and space, so he is the companion of Moses, travels with Alexander, talks to Justinian, meets Shah Jahan of the Mughal Empire, and encounters many rulers through the practice of incubation, when these rulers spend the night in a sacred place to encounter the divine and find Hudr waiting for them. In the sharing of spaces, he is seen as the intermediary figure affecting the transition of a sacred space from church to shrine. So, in his visitation to the sites of the figures of, for example, of St. George and St. Theodore, Hudr serves to mark continuity and significance of these figures within a relatively new formed sacred landscape, which also becomes Islamic. Hasluk, the person who's talked about and written most on this, studying the materials of the 16th century visitors to Elwan, I might have passed. Maybe I don't have this. I will come back to Hasluk, studying the materials of 16th century visitors to Elwan Çelebi Tekke near Çorum, argued that Hudr was the ambiguous cultic transitional figure that transformed the Christian site into a Muslim one. To the Christians who believed in the miracles of St. George and St. Theodore, Hudr who performed miracles seemed the same. And in fact, studying the image, a scholar studying the image and identity of dragon slayers, St. George and Hudr are both identified as dragon slayers in medieval Anatolia, maintains that the web-like complexity of these identifications is evident particularly in the case of dragon-slaying saint heroes whose legend and iconography readily traversed fluid cultural boundaries. If the slaying of the dragon was a common imagery in the ties between Christians, I have to go back, sorry, in the ties between Christians and Muslims, the water imagery identifies Hudr with Elijah, as he is pictured in the Bible as a rainmaker, and still today many shrines in the Balkans and the Middle East reflect this understanding of the prophet. The legend that brings Hudr and Elijah together is about the day that they meet on earth to confirm their agreement about the areas of the world that each would attend to and rescue and help travelers. This is something that I was told in Greece as well as in Istanbul and in many shrines. So in some stories also, Elijah and Hudr meet on earth and then they go together to make pilgrimage to Mecca. These are popular stories you still hear in the shrines across the Middle East and the Balkans, as attested by especially anthropologists. But Hudr links popular culture to also elite culture. At the hands of the powerful, he is used to sacralize and Islamicize non-Muslim territories and spaces. For example, the Byzantine Church of Hagia Sophia, when after the conquest of Constantinople, Mehmed II wanted to manufacture an Ottoman narrative for the church, he ordered Şemseddin Karabati to write a history of the building. And in this history, which becomes celebrated as mythical, Hıdır appears 3 times in the dreams of Justinian, therefore inserting a Muslim saint into the construction of this otherwise strictly Byzantine monument. The first time, Hıdır tells Justinian to build the church to the glory of God and Christianity and to acclaim the defeat of paganism by Christianity. The second time, Hıdır advises Justinian to have the Prophet Muhammad's saliva and pure soil from Mecca used to repair the parts of the dome that had collapsed. Therefore, as you can see, as the Ottoman constructed their myths and legends and their glorious history, they claimed in the construction of that history, they claimed a mixed ancestry to the building and to the spaces. Hagia Sophia, in their imagination, was already Islamicized during the time of Muhammad. It was not purely Christian, but in the process of claiming an identity, an Islamic identity, they also, however, helped circulate ideas of a new layering and blending of histories and civilizations. Their telling of this narrative, and there are many more like this, actually acknowledged and glorified what came before them as much as who they were. Conclusion. If I was successful, I took you from the contemporary sharing of sacred sites into their historical origins of this phenomenon to underscore the degree to which the beginnings of this process were marked by an openness to the other, exchanges across frontiers, intermingling and blending of stories and legends that circulated in the vast space of civilizational contact. That colonization happened to be effected by Sufi orders open to Christianity, imbued with antinomian beliefs, made it easier for the conquered population to agree, adapt, and accept. That shared saint worship and the hagiographies of the time encouraged this mixing by telling the stories of saints and heroes that crossed boundaries, were comfortable in different cultures, and were seen as men and women of the people was important. That communities of joint worship were formed, interspersed across empires, providing spaces of encounter, respect, but also tension and conflict, provided for negotiated arrangements, choreographies of sharing, temporal, spatial, ritual accommodations. Of the sort, now that we're together, let's figure out how to share the space. You're outside, I'm inside. You take the altar on this side, I will take the mihrab facing Mecca. All of these sorts of arrangements that I simplify here, but that were made in negotiation between communities. That such integration and incorporation occurred under the rule of empires is also significant and needs to be highlighted. Empires are interested in creating legibility by ordering and managing diversity rather than eliminating it, allowing boundary relations as well as crossing of boundaries. National states create legibility by eliminating and assimilating diversity, creating in the process conflictual and contested boundaries as identities become polarized instead. To conclude, the sharing of sacred sites shared sacred sites are examples of diversity working and tolerance between groups emanating from respect for the religious traditions and rituals. It allows for the emergence of a collective effervescence among otherwise differentiated groups within a space, and it builds a tie that is carried out into the secular life. Such examples impact our understanding of accommodation and tolerance today, and the need to identify, without instrumentalizing, agents, symbols, and structures that can bridge boundaries and pacify tensions. Thank you. I wanted to show, just 1 second.
Okay.
I forgot to show as usual, but this is the three saints. It's a co-location in a book that we created of Hıdır, Elias, a network structure, and George, and of the key words that they share, like saint, Bektashi, Tekke, etc., that shows the way in which these saints were actually joined and related to each other.
Do you have time for some questions?
Yeah.
So I think the floor is open. I'll moderate, okay? Just in case there's a huge,
Yeah.
So I point you as you're up.
Okay, and I have some.
Oh, you can bet.
Here.
So the floor is open. I got the way this way.
Anybody have questions?
Jonathan, ask a question so you get.
Yes, we did that.
Because it, yeah.
Thank you for this wonderful talk and for bringing the world from which I come to life.
Very much so.
And I'm wondering, you spoke about the ways in which the sacred site made the possibility of diverse faith traditions coming together. Is it possible for that diversity that comes together in this fluid, effervescent way, as you pointed out, actually can it be transferred into public life? Do you see that possibility? Because it's a very different thing to be together in the sacred space. And it's very different to be outside of it.
Exactly. And that is probably the hardest part of the project, in the sense that the shared site is, as I ended, it's a particular moment, it's a particular temporality. It's coming together in a space that brings a kind of effervescence. So it's at the moment it's beautiful, but we shouldn't forget that actually the shared site is also a site of conflict and tension. It's not always perfect. And within the site itself, you have continuous negotiations for it to work smoothly. So there are tactics, there are ways in which the Sveti Nikola is a very good example of a shrine that is shared very nicely for a while, and then immigrant Christians from actually the US come and live in a neighboring area. They come and they put a cross on the top of the entrance to the shrine, and creating a moment of conflict. And then how that conflict is diffused shows the skills of particular individuals, no doubt, but also how much people are willing to give up, how much they're willing to demand from the other, okay? And what the incentives are to making the shrine work and continue to work. Sometimes it's also commercial incentives, because people who come bring, gifts and things like that. So it is a microcosm actually of the larger society, because it has its tensions as well. So that's one point. The other thing is that so the places that I worked in Istanbul are places, the Greek Orthodox churches. people who come to these churches, and it's by all means not perfect. I'm not claiming this is all very tenuous, and we're living, clearly Turkey is living a moment of Sunnification and very harsh, in a sense, Muslim identification in some ways. But these conversations, these relations that are constructed in the contemporary today actually also continue in the secular life of people. So they meet in the church. They spend an afternoon there. Sometimes they go to another sacred space together, and they go from a Christian to a Muslim space, for example. That's very often the case. They do things together. They create community for their outside lives as well. I'm not claiming that it's going to solve the problems of difference in the modern world. But I make two claims. One is that actually we need to understand the internal dynamics, and I haven't talked at all about the clergy and the imams, who also are parts of this negotiation. So we need to think about that, but I couldn't put everything in one talk. So that's another part. I have a lot of interviews with clergymen and how they think about this. But so on the one hand, we need to think of this particular place as an example of shared sites, and there are many. They're still in Tunisia, between Jews and Muslims, in places in Israel, between Christians and between Muslims and Jews. There are many sites like that. So they're important in that sense. But also, I have another. And that's where, there's another part to the work I do, is that I think in this historical moment, or in this contemporary moment, we have lost this alternative narrative. We have lost this narrative that says, and Peter Brown, the historian from Princeton, whom I adore, has always talked about this and written about this. This narrative of people getting along, that there was a history and a long period of accommodation between these three religions. And part of the goal of creating the website and doing museum work and doing all kinds of other projects is to put out there examples of what works. To understand what works, to be able to come up with mechanisms and things like that, and talk about it more generally.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I had a comment on the narrative, the legitimacy that you mentioned so rightly with the Ottomans. Part of that legitimacy also was their own anxiety about the acceptance of a sort of a non-lineage caliphate, right? Yeah. So they had many such dreams, I think, in terms of this, the dream narratives that needed to be. So this was really enlightening to see that it was in the context of a space, and I really appreciated that. My question to you was that, as you mentioned at the beginning of your talk, similar spaces, shared spaces exist in so many parts of the world. And I've lived, like you did, in Istanbul, in India, having shared many of these spaces. One of the things that is common in South Asia is for communities, even when they are not shared spaces on a regular basis, the saints, the death anniversary, the Urs, becomes an occasion for hundreds, if not thousands of people to come together. And you see that with Rumi, of course, in Konya. Are these places also operating with some of those saints' narratives of the anniversary?
Of saints' death,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So especially the anniversaries of the death of the Sufi sheikhs and bring a lot of joint ceremonies. So the tekke where I work, the Durbalı tekke in Larissa in Greece, has that tradition of the saints' days. So they're both, St. George's Day, which is the 23rd of April, but also the Sufi Sheikh days that also are celebrated and bring people together. So it is very similar actually to the Hindu-Muslim sharing that a colleague of mine works on, Christophe Chaverlot in France, has written a lot about this.
Yeah.
It's very common too, yeah.
Have you been shaken next?
Hi, Karen.
Hi,
So much of this is about the sacrality of space
yes.
rather than the forms of worship practiced by the different religions. And we ordinarily read about the sacrality of space being one of those things that's bulldozed by modern secularism. And so I'm wondering about the interface between this notion of sharing sacred spaces and a secularism that would tend to flatten space and to eliminate the sacrality of space itself. And one could ask the same question of time, as these are particular moments and days in which this sharing is taking place in a world where moments and days are being robbed of their sacrality.
So what you're asking me is whether that type of spatial sacralization can be transferred to a secular. I mean, it's a difficult question. I keep thinking that, in a sense, even in our secular times, the spaces that are that gain that sacrality are spaces of worship, modern worship, but also are spaces of coexistence, of places that, where the space is open and welcoming to everyone. I think that that's what makes it sacred in a way. In that way, it's transferable. But I think we are aware of this because, like in Berlin now, there is this project on creating the House of One, which is building a new kind of space that will have a little church, a space that will be for Christians, a space for Jews and for Muslims, but will be very open and fluid between and to me, I think the sacrality is about the movability, and that is a public space. I mean, the most, if you will, a public space is a sacred space in that way. In the modern, the public square is the modern sacred space. Or, as my son would say, it's the Apple computer shrine place.
I have here. Yes, sir.
I don't know if I answered you, but
So one question is, these places have lasted in this form for a long time. That's in cases. A question is, what enables them to last as a shared space? And I'm particularly wondering whether it requires one group to acknowledge the ownership of the space by another, or is it alternatively some kind of delicate balancing of shared ownership? One can imagine that in cases where it's not clear who really owns the space, the tension might rise and the whole thing might dissolve. So I wonder if you have some more general impressions of whether, to what extent, that kind of concession is critical for these places to stay open to the other.
yeah. So actually, in my book Empire of Difference, I talk about the fact that partly the success of empires is about creating boundaries and marking boundaries, but also letting fluidity across them. It's both acknowledging that there is a boundary and letting movement, Okay? Movement could be actually very organized and directed by the authorities, whether they're religious authorities or public authorities of other sort. And I think it works the same way. Ownership in most of these cases is of one religion owning. It's either the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate that claims ownership, or it's the Muslim local community that claims ownership. And the distinction is very clear. This is a church, this is a shrine, a Muslim shrine, this is a mosque. However, the action, the crossing is allowed. And I think that's what makes, in a sense, for stability. I try to develop that in my book, to try to show in different contexts how these boundaries both were marked, yet allowed crossings. And I think that's an important way of thinking about it. And the place in Jerusalem, is shared by Christian Holy Sepulchre. Thank you. The Holy Sepulchre is not very, clearly bounded, and you look on the web or you look on particular days, the monks are hitting each other on the head because one has passed crossed the boundary of the other. So when it is not fully defined, I think it's worse, actually. So boundaries are okay, but you need to let movement across them.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to see that. I think you're with the Department of Sociology here at Berkeley.
Yeah.
The historical sociology of religion, that's such a major field. Is that the field you identify with?
Well, I got into religion through the back door. I didn't train as a sociologist of religion, actually. I'm a comparative political historical sociologist. That's my label.
Okay.
But then I worked on toleration and the Ottoman Empire and worked on religion, and then I got pulled into this in a sense too, partly because I lived it. I grew up in this kind of multi-religious, multilingual environment, so I wanted to understand it.
In that vein, what take do you have on cognate phenomenon? Not shared spaces, at least not right away, but shared sacred names. You mentioned Mary in the Quran, but in Catholic Christianity there's Fatima, Our Lady of Fatima, Portuguese tradition, and Fatima is Muhammad's most blessed, most favored daughter, if you will.
Yeah.
So, not that the shrine of Our Lady of Fatima is a shared space, I don't think, but you will find Muslims visiting Our Lady of Fatima.
Yeah. Well, I think the sharing of sacred personages, whether they are saints or Mary, the Abrahamic tradition, in a sense, Abraham is also a really important an important trope for sharing, because he speaks to all three religions. And so all these figures are useful for convincing, in a way, the people of their familiarity with each other. That's the key. It's knowing the other. It's knowing being familiar and not being, it's the lack of fear, in a sense. And I think that speaks to the modern condition too, and it's about civilizational discourse, which I think we're losing.
The emphasis on the three Abrahamic religions, I associate that idea with a sociologist. He taught sociology at the University of Cairo, Louis Massignon.
Yes, yes, for sure.
He's very sensitive to shared sacrality, shared persons.
Yeah. Louis Massignon is a large part of our exhibition, in Marseille and now in Greece, in Thessaloniki. We feature him as one of the scholars who actually worked, an intermediary figure between Islam and Christianity. It was very important.
Thank you.
Thank you for this talk. I was wondering, you were talking, a lot of your examples of this mixing were happening on feast days, festival days. And I was wondering how much of that you would see in line with some of the scholarship on carnivals and feast days as a moment of inversion of social relationships or ability for transgression, versus sort of, you know, some of the others that you hinted at but didn't talk about as much during this talk, about sort of everyday mixing or coming together. Can you say more on that?
So both are very prevalent. There is everyday mixing, and there are special days and pilgrimages. So you have all of that. Pilgrimages do become, in a sense, a particular type of phenomena where, so the pilgrimage in Bukada, in the island where I grew up, is in a sense, it started as a pilgrimage of going to the monastery and between Muslims and Christians and Jews, and it has transformed itself into something that is a little, in a sense, more than just a regular pilgrimage, in the sense that now it has also all kinds of Christian fundamentalist and proselytizing groups who come to try to think, who see it as a moment and a particular space and time where the Turkish authorities are not going to interfere because there's a lot of tension on this issue, as a moment to also use this for proselytizing and change the kind of meaning of the space. So there is a lot that is happening in that particular pilgrimage that I have observed that seems to take it out of its more traditional place. I don't know that that's an inversion of the particular social relations there. It's an additive. It's a marketization of religion in a sense. It's a different phenomenon. But a lot of these spaces have daily visitors. Daily visitors. In Turkey today, these churches are not open also every day because there are so few people who go to church every day. But when they are open, the neighborhood Muslims will come, will spend time, will light a candle, and I will be sitting there waiting for them to come. You know, there's a steady flow of people. And some churches are known to be open Mondays, some are known to be open Tuesdays, so you go from church to church in a sense. And some people do this sacred geography. They go from church to church. They will go on Monday to one and Tuesday to another and Thursday to yet another one, and I'll see them in every day. So there is a everyday life component to it, and there's a pilgrimage component and sacred days component to it.
I have two people who are now at the mics, one over here and then
Thanks, Karen. Wonderful talk. My question is actually a follow-up to Claude's, who asked about what sustains these spaces. I wonder if you could say something about when or why or how they fail as shared spaces. Is it a lack of clear boundaries and a lack of movement, or are there other factors that lead to the failure of these spaces?
Multiple reasons why they fail. I mean, the first one is war. So when armies, invade a place, often, the shrines are burnt and places lose, so people move and abandon places, etc. So that's one of and clearly through the Balkans you have a lot of that happening with the wars and the invasions, etc. So war is one thing. The other thing when they fail is the actions of the more orthodox leaders of the community. So either the imams or the Greek Orthodox priest, who then will fight against the sharing and argue that according to Orthodox practices, sharing is not allowed, and try to separate the communities. So that is a case, and there are a few cases in Macedonia where we know now that partly it was the clergy led to the separation. So those are the two most important, and then internal fights that develop over time. And then I need to say that this is partly also the historical part of this project is very difficult, because it's not like I can take a church in the 14th century and bring it to the 21st century. There are breaks, and if a traveler report doesn't exist, if somebody hasn't, if there isn't material on it, I don't know if it collapsed or if it didn't. So partly it's my historical ignorance of the continuity. But I also have, as a sociologist, as a, tendency to think that practices, when they bring peace and when they are successful, get institutionalized and get locked in and get reproduced. So I think, I don't know how to show that yet historically, but I think if I could, that would be part of my argument, that successful cases get locked in and reproduced. But I cannot say that yet. I need more work on this before I can say that.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I really appreciate it. I'm wondering, from the Muslim community, you mentioned mostly Sufis as sort of being the vanguard of crossing the boundaries or allowing the boundaries to be crossed. And you mentioned the Sufis, because of their antinomian tendencies, are the ones doing this. So I'm wondering, antinomian tendencies suggests a kind of a heterodoxy or a loosening of kind of the orthodox norms. To what extent does that fluidity with orthodoxy, to what extent is that required in order to make this kind of boundary crossing work?
I think it's very, very required, because what we see is that as the empire itself becomes more Sunni, after it conquers the Arab lands and becomes identified with a stronger Sunni identity, there is in a sense, a hardening of the arteries, and that makes it more difficult for initiating new cases of mixing. I do believe that part of this, in the Balkans too, it was about, the Balkans had a lot of heterodoxies running around in that time period of the Byzantine Empire. So there is a synergy between what is happening to the questioning in Christianity and the questioning in Islam, and it happens to coincide at that time period.
No, you're up. Sorry, I'm just directing the mic to the next person. Yeah.
So thank you very much. This was so interesting and helpful. And one of the things that caught my attention when you were talking about the historical context was the role of narratives of interreligious marriage.
Yes. Yes.
As a condition of possibility. And I'm thinking about my tiny corner of the world where I work on the relationship between ritual and kinship. And I'm wondering about the sources of tension or anxiety that are presented by problems of proselytization and how marrying out of religion can sometimes mean marrying out of family, and that could be a real problem. So I'm wondering to what extent that has come up in the
Well, the way it has come up is that, there are incredible numbers of cross-border marriages during the Seljuk times and during the early Ottoman times, where, Christian wives are taken by Seljuk and Ottoman sultans, and where actually in the case of the Seljuk Sultan, he even constructs a church for his wife to be able to worship freely in the church and not be constrained. So there are lots of marriages. In the harems, there are lots of women who are, Muslim, and lots of women who are Christian, and there is this familiarity as well as probably tensions. Now, I don't know of work that has actually talked about this and has brought enough historical material to discuss what kinds of relations those were. But we know that there were lots of cross-border marriages and a lot of familiarity because of that.
Here you go. And then I'm going to take a last question for myself, Dia.
So thank you. I really enjoyed your talk. And I have an historian question that has to do with the relationship between the Ottoman Empire and the other empires that existed in Europe especially during the early modern period, which is the period I work on. And I was thinking that so the Ottoman Empire was perceived by many European observers in the early modern period as a powerful example of religious pluralism. So, for example, Erasmus famously said that it was easier to be a Christian in Ottoman Constantinople than in confessional Europe.
Yeah.
And so, and much work has been done on the Western perception of the Ottoman Empire. But I was thinking instead, so what was the Ottoman perception of confessional Europe? Were the Ottomans interested in the ways in which confessional Europe tried to solve the problem of religious pluralism?
Yes, they not only were interested in the way that the Europeans sorted out their issues, but they also often wrote about it. And now I will forget exactly the date, but there is a short edict of toleration that the Pasha of Buddha writes about. I have it in my book Empire of Difference. He writes an edict of toleration discussing the problems in Europe and telling them how they should behave towards their own diverse societies. So this is very much part of, and especially at the borders of the Habsburg and the Ottoman, you have missives onto the other side about the way they're treating, and it's important to them because also it's part of their strategy. Okay, part of the strategy of the Ottomans, in a sense, they understood very well that the divisions between Orthodox Christianity and Latin Christianity was a problem. And after the sack of Constantinople, that division is very much in the minds of the Turkish chiefs who fight in the Balkans. So all of this is very much part of their understanding. They are reading. Mehmet II has an incredible library where he has works from the Byzantine Empire, from a lot of other places. He has stuff translated. He has Byzantine clerks. So there is incredible knowledge, but it's more than just knowledge. It is that the Ottomans, and that's so important for, I think, the world we live in and this Muslim-Christian thing, the Ottomans really see themselves as the next empire, the continuity of the Roman Byzantines and the Ottomans. That's a trajectory for them. They understand themselves in terms of that. It's a civilizational project. And they use the titles of, the titles that they use of emperor and Kaiser and things like that are titles to impress and to claim continuity. That's one of the things that, the empire is the genius of it in a sense, and what is totally misunderstood by Turkey and Erdogan today of claiming, he claims Ottomanism, but he doesn't understand that Ottomanism really is continuity with Europe.
Actually leads to my question. So I wondered if you might take off the historian's hat and put on the contemporary observer's hat. You've been working in these communities, these shrines, and Turkey's going through an amazing moment of religious, political upheaval. I wonder if you could just talk about whether you think that these shrines are offering resources for people in that context. Are they a last gasp of an old world that in 10 years we'll look back on fondly with nostalgia? Or are they something which is living and continuing in some way, given the pace of change in the last 15 years in Turkey?
So I would love to be a fly in the wall of one of my churches and be there now to see how, like the one that I really kind of worked most at, the first of the month church. I would like to be there to see how people are reacting to the changes and what the conversations are, because there is a very clear, these spaces are also spaces, and we've talked about this in my other presentation at BCSR. They're places of politics too. There are people who come to these shrines because they want to say, we are cosmopolitan, we are, people who want to cross boundaries, we are fighting against the Sunnification of the country. So I am sure that these spaces today, and I cannot go unfortunately to observe, but I'm sure that they are spaces that are thinking their modality, their new modality in a sense. And a lot of these spaces have also encountered, by the way, in the last few years, the kind of tightening of the news of Sunnification, like, spaces tables being put in front of these churches, or the space with Qurans, where the local community of Muslims come and tries to tell them to read the Quran instead. The Muslims read the Quran instead of going to the shared site. So they have experience with that, and whether they will disappear, I don't know, because people keep coming back. And I just one of the pictures I showed you, the little girl doing the pilgrimage up, is by Malek, who is a friend of ours who was at the pilgrimage 3 days ago, the 23rd of April, and said that it was fully, thousands and hundreds of thousands of people were there. This indicates to me that people will continue doing it.
Thanks so much. Thank you all for coming.